Welcome back to the last session for today. We're going to have a panel discussion to close out managing the insider threat, what every organization should know. So our panel is going to be moderated by Mr. Robert Floodeen. Robert is the technical advisor to the SEI Director's Office here at the SEI. And for a little background on Rob, prior to his current position, he's worked across federal and Department of Defense operations in the United States. He has led teams performing intrusion detection at the Pentagon, Army Research Lab, and for the Defense Research and Engineering Network, or DREN. Additionally, he spent several years managing CSIRT operations for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So I'd like to kick it over to Rob. Rob, thank you very much for your participation. Gentlemen, thanks again for all your presentations today. Have a great panel discussion.
Thank you, Shane. Our panel discussion today will focus on insider threat challenge problems facing organizations. Our panel this afternoon is composed of 5 CERT staff members. During this segment, our panelists will address, through different lenses, the challenge organizations have with the mitigation of insider threats. We will start with Bill Claycomb, lead research scientist for the CERT Insider Threat Team. His focus for today will be on developing indicators of insider threats and associated data sets. Next is Randy Trzeciak, technical manager for CERT's Enterprise Threat and Vulnerability Management Team. Randy will be focusing on identification and usage of data sources containing non-technical observables. And then we have Andy Moore, lead researcher of the CERT Insider Threat Research Team, measuring the effectiveness of practices to mitigate risks posed by insider threats. Followed by Alex Nicoll, technical team lead, Insider Threat Technical Solutions, learning from insiders who are not getting caught. I don't think I meant it quite that way. Last but not least, Kurt Wallnau, senior research scientist for CERT's Science of Cybersecurity team, focusing on improving insider threat research. I have some questions prepared, but we would prefer to address the audience questions, so please submit them. And we'll start off with Bill. So Bill, how common or easy is it for researchers to gain access to insider threat-related data sets?
Thanks, Rob. This is really one of the big challenges in doing insider threat research is having data that's usable. And by that, I mean that there are a number of different ways to approach this problem. The way that CERT has historically approached it is empirically. We collect cases of actual insider threats where people have been convicted of crimes and through a very in-depth process, conduct analysis on those. But those are all bad guys, right? And so the challenge there is knowing how they compare to good population, good assumed good people. So one other way to do research in this area is to look at data sets of everyone in the organization, everyone in an organization, and their behavior either with the IT system or with other people, right? And in that case, we're dealing with much larger data sets. So if you imagine an organization that might have 10,000 people, they have the potential to collect gigabytes and petabytes of information on their employees' behavior. Now, you asked about the challenges or how easy it is. It's difficult to get access to those types of data sets, and it's not because organizations don't want to share it, but there are lots of challenges involved. The information oftentimes contains personal information about employees. It contains email, and the email may have other protections associated with it. So for an organization to just hand over petabytes of data they've collected is really unreasonable. And so one thing that we've tried to do is partner with organizations, go on site, and with the proper agreements in place, engage with their researchers to look at their data. The most important piece about the most important thing to have in place when doing that is the ground truth on who the insiders are. So knowing within that population who are the users that have acted in a malicious way, because then we can take their behaviors and the way their behaviors were detected and actually extract real indicators, real ways of looking for the insiders at that organization. So.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
But it does sound pretty intensive. Are there any default data sets that exist, or any other ways to get data besides going to an organization and working with them specifically?
So there are, and if depends on the type of data that you're looking for. With respect to email data, which email data can provide a lot of clues about potential insider threat, insider intent. You can monitor for changes in the way that a person's email comes across over time. So email is a common way to begin looking for insiders. And there are data sets out there, for instance, the Enron data set that has emails from a large organization over a period of time. There are challenges to working with that data set. Certainly not representative of every organization, but it does provide, those types of things provide a springboard for other research to occur. You can establish methods using that data and then take it into an organization. But Enron is the biggest data set that I know of. There are other types of data sets out there, network-based monitoring, monitoring of network traffic that are also.
How hard is it to get a hold of the Enron data set? Is that something I could go get if I wanted to?
There are a number of sites. The Carnegie Mellon Computer Science Department, for instance, has a link to the data. I don't remember the URL off the top of my head, but it's fairly easy to get to. Now, for researchers, a word of caution for researchers, there is some debate over whether that data set is proper to use for research, because it does contain personal information on the people that wrote the emails. And so some places the Institutional Review Board has decided that it is actually human subject research and is not allowed. So something to consider if you use that data set.
Okay. Kurt, Bill mentioned research sets and researchers in general. Do you have anything to add about gathering data or getting access to data sets to look at these types of issues with insider threat?
Well, as I mentioned, the DARPA Adams program, which is essentially an insider threat detection program, created a business relationship with an industry user, and that user provided access to anonymized data, host monitored time series data of user behavior, 5,000 to 10,000 users. So it's possible with adequate privacy safeguards to actually get deep data sets and to draw some conclusions. But the challenge is, of course, to publish the results in a way that could be replicated, because even the schema that is being used to collect the data may be considered commercially sensitive, if not the data itself. But I think if the audience is interested, they should look for some papers, maybe keyword search on Adams, and find what science is being reported on the corpus. I think the challenge, even in that case, though, is something that Bill alluded to. The behaviors in that case that are being reported are relative to a particular organization and their practices in a particular industry. And even in a particular region of the country, in a particular state of the economy. And, it's not clear how to draw inference from what is detected there versus what might be detected elsewhere. And as a practical matter, and this is an IRB issue, we have ground truth that this is what people are doing. But for practical reasons, we have to assume that even in a corpus of 10,000 people, there are no insiders. We're not in the business of actually detecting real insider behavior, and so if there's a base incident rate, that has to be overcome in the scenarios that we generate, the test scenarios. In order to make those scenarios become more visible than the base rate, we have to exaggerate something. So there's quite a few confounds in experimental method in using even large anonymized data sets. It's not really a panacea. Even if we had them, there would be some questions about what conclusions we can draw.
So based on what you just said, I want to clarify one item, IRB issue. Could you expound on what IRB is for our audience?
It would be inappropriate for an anonymized data set to be fed to a DoD program and have that program use that anonymized data set and purport to find real bad behavior and report that bad behavior back to the provider of the data.
Okay.
So the IRB and the protocols to protect users ensures that it's a one-way flow, which is why Dr. Waltzman refers to the lab as Vegas. Only private information goes in, but nothing comes out other than summary results.
Right.
And in fact, it's never the intent, and it's never even on the table for the research teams to be trying to ferret out what real behaviors are. Their job is to find the data, the scenarios that we're inserting, and it's our job to make sure that those are representative of what the insider threat community thinks or says is representative bad behavior. Which
Rob, I just want to echo something, that's a very important point that Kurt brought up, is that base rate is really low, and we're not even sure what the base rate is of actual insider activity, because most of them are never reported if they're even caught. And so he's right, 10,000 users may not be enough. 10,000 users over 5 years may not be enough to detect malicious data. Now, we do conduct research on the other side. There are components of our team that do actually go in and look for the actual insiders within the data. And to Kurt's point on IRBs, that's not considered research. It's not funded as research. But that informs the scenario generation, because now we have actual ground truth of what a real insider looked like, and then we can make the synthetic insiders look even more real.
Okay. So you both sort of touched on a topic about not knowing if there is an insider in the data set you're looking at or not. So let's shift gears over to Alex. Alex, they mentioned a low base rate. How do you go about looking for finding insiders in a data set if you don't know there's insiders in there?
It's really, really difficult to start with. You can take a look at the data and you can see essentially use statistics to find some normalized data patterns, some standard behaviors essentially that you can apply generally across the organization, and then look for outliers from that standard behavior pattern. You can also do a number of tests. You can k-means clustering for various types of metrics. You can look at the access patterns that each of those users have over periods of time. And the idea is to look at it from enough angles that you can essentially start correlating different metrics across your data set and hope that you've got the right metrics and that correlation is strong enough to tell you that you may have actually found an insider.
Okay, so let's move over to Andy then. How does this impact, actually, scratch that. Let's go to Randy.
Sure.
We'll finish with you, Andy, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Non-observables. So we're hearing about data sets, looking at data, we're looking at technical solutions. Mm-hmm. Now, what are non-observables?
The non-technical observables?
Yes.
Yeah, so certainly what we want to recommend across any organization is to use your IT systems to detect activity that may be considered suspicious. Alex talked about how we can do that. But what we believe is that a technical solution alone may not be the most effective way, given that insiders are doing what they traditionally do on a regular day-to-day basis, using an application and are authorized to do that, but in some small cases they have malicious intent. So the tools today are very hard to differentiate something that is with malicious intent compared to what's part of your normal day-to-day activity in terms of an application and or business process. So what we want to recommend is that if an organization has the ability to look across the organization for what some of the non-technical observables are, that might help form a bigger picture of what or who might be considered more likely to carry out some type of suspicious activity. A couple of the data sources you might want to consider would be things from your HR system. Things that we could consider would include also things that the organization does, the events and action conditions. So for example, if an organization is undergoing a massive layoff or a reorganization or a merger or acquisition, or that they have as a policy to not give raises in a year, or the raises aren't what they were expected, or bonuses are not to whatever the level of expectations are, you might be able to look in a data set within HR to identify people who may be impacted by that organization, event, or action condition, and then combine that with what you might be able to use from your IT department to have a better picture of what or who might be more likely to go down the path of considering harming a critical asset. You might want to combine that with your physical security systems as well. We have a number of systems that will track badging access or attempts into areas. Again, if we have the ability to have a tool that can go out to your badging system, it might be able to identify someone who's outside of their normal entry or exit from a particular area. Again, not one of these observables which we've described would say this person is the insider threat, but the better picture you have across the organization might include some of the non-technical behaviors. You might have a better chance to identify someone who may be more at risk.
Okay, so I heard two great examples going to HR and to security. Is that correct? Okay.
Yep.
So Andy, based on everything we've just heard, what confidence are organizations going to have in their measures and their measurements?
Well, I think we've heard a lot of the complexity of the problem, and I think it comes down to, how can we measure the effectiveness of the controls that we put in place to that address these concerns. And those measures of effectiveness have to do with measuring the characteristics of the bad guy. In our case, it's the malicious insider. The characteristics of the good guy, right? The normal employee, person who's doing the job that they're meant to do, doing it faithfully, and measuring and being able to characterize the difference between those two. And let me give you an example of how some of these problems arise in research. We identified from a more or less informal analysis of data several years ago that as we were looking at theft of intellectual property cases, that a lot of the cases had some theft within 30 days of termination. Okay, well, this suggests a kind of leverage point for organizations, because organizations can't monitor everybody all the time for everything. And so you've got to look for those high leverage points in the kind of attack or compromise life cycle. So we started looking at the data, doing a more formal analysis, and a more formal analysis of the cases showed that actually that it was a 60-day window, not a 30-day window, was probably more recommended, and that you could in looking at these theft of IP cases, you could detect 70% of the IP thieves within 60 days, if you looked at 60 days prior to their termination for that last theft event. Now that raises a big question to anybody that's interested in this, because you can say you have to ask the question, well, how does an organization detect that last event? How is it different from what everybody else in the organization is doing? And so what do you look at? So I can say that, I could catch 70% of the IP thieves, if I have this 60-day window, but, how do I know that I'm actually gonna be able to distinguish that from somebody who's acting faithfully? So you can ask, well, was there a difference in what the malicious insider did in terms of the methods they used, the size of information downloaded that was exfiltrated from the organization, the location of the information that was stolen? What kind of properties can you look at with regard to that theft that might help you distinguish the bad guy's actions from the good guy's actions? I'm just saying that's, we're engaged in this research now, and that's kind of why it's such a hard problem, because it's not always easy to make that distinction.
Okay, so let's go back to Bill. So Andy mentioned looking at the methods that were used, the size of the data that was downloaded, the location of the data. I believe Randy mentioned physical access possibly as well. So what are some clues or some hints what's some advice that some organizations could follow when trying to capture their own data sets? Do we have some?
Certainly. Unfortunately, the answer is not it's simple. The answer is it's complicated, and there are a number of different data sources. So there's no one answer and one checklist to follow. It really depends on the type of organization, the type of loss or damage that they're more susceptible to, that they fear the most. But for instance, if an organization was most concerned with the theft of IP or data leaving the organization, so then they'll want to monitor the paths that an employee could use to exfiltrate data. And exfiltrate is a word that doesn't show up on the spell check on the most word processors, but it's a word that we use commonly to take information out of an organization, or data egress. One of our partner organizations has categorized data egress into 5 different categories. That could be printing, it could be email, could be just a plain network-based transfer, could be USB drives, and it could be writable media, CD-ROMs, things like that. So those generally cover all of the types of methods that an insider could use to extract data. And so you want to look at, each of those. So the tools that you might pick would be a host-based monitoring tool, something that runs on the actual machines that employees use, or if in a virtual environment that runs within each session that an employee has, that monitors very specific things. And the tools are very powerful these days. Really, the technology is emerging and continues to emerge with tools that are able to detect every single keystroke, every single mouse movement, application launch, every single thing the user does. Now, you can, I suppose, capture all that. It's very difficult and space-consuming, so you have to be very specific about what you capture. So you can also use network-based monitoring and looking at network traffic. You can, you want to monitor what employees are printing, so there are ways to do that. The important thing about analyzing that data is baselining. What that means is understanding what the behavior of users normally is, and we're not distinguishing good or bad. It's just what is the behavior of users, and typically we like to think about that baselining in three stages. One is, what is the normal behavior of the organization? What is the average number of pieces of paper that an employee prints, any employee, right? And so you can look for deviations from that standard to find outliers, somebody who's printing too much, for instance. Then we look at baselining the group. So my group may not print hardly anything at all versus the corporation average. So if I do any printing, that is anomalous among my group. But you need to know what the group is, and the group can be coworkers or people in the same physical office building. And then most importantly, and the biggest challenge is baselining the individual user. So what is the user's behavior on a number of different features? When do I log in? When do I log off? How many emails do I send? How many emails do I send externally? How many of those have attachments? How big are those attachments? I mean, you can see it can get extremely detailed very, very quickly. But knowing which of those to baseline is a challenge, but knowing where to spot the potentials of indicators of malicious behavior. You could look for anomalies, big spikes. You could look for certain thresholds being passed. You can look for certain if you have a rule set that describes a pattern of behavior, as soon as the insider has done X, Y, and Z, that's an indicator. So there are a number of different ways to do that. But and collecting the data, collecting the right data, and then baselining are the three most important steps.
And that varies a lot by organization, too, or organization type, right? And so you might have different profiles for different organizations that you might need to consider.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, and different organizations have different policies on what can and cannot be collected. So, and certainly that varies internationally as well. So in some countries you're able to monitor certain things, in other countries you're not. Yeah.
I have a question on tools, and I think you actually kicked it off for us. So if I could try to rephrase what it is you said succinctly, I'd like to open then the question up to the entire panel. So tools, what types of abilities should any tool, have? And what I think I heard you say was some of the things that the tool should have would be the ability to monitor hosts, monitor networks, to baseline, to create profiles, and to create profiles at different levels. So not just a single profile for a user, but the profile for the group and other types of activities. Is there anything else that anyone would like to add to what types of capabilities good tools should have today, besides capturing 80 gigabits a second?
So I'd like to open up by saying that we haven't found one tool yet that does everything. It really needs to be focused on the asset of what you're trying to protect. So if you're in the scenario that Bill described, trying to protect information from leaving the network, there are categories of tools that would identify when someone accesses the asset, tries to send it off the network or download it to some of those exfiltration paths. That would be one category of tool. There are other types of tools, depending on what you're trying to protect, which would get into the resiliency of a piece of technology. So that particular strategy is making sure that a particular technology is up and running based upon your service level agreements. That's another category of tool which will look for people accessing that technology and trying to disable that particular technology. And other types of tools which be able to identify where critical files might be accessed or changed or modified. So there's a suite of tools which will be put into an organization which would identify specific activity that could be alerted on. That would be in combination with other types of tools which will aggregate lots of data that exists out there, pulls it together, and you are allowed to write rules or analysis on the aggregated data to identify suspicious activity. So to be clear, just to provide a general framework of we haven't found a tool yet, it should be a defense in depth strategy of a number of tools that should be deployed across the organization, and it's really focused on what asset are you trying to protect, the information, the technology, the people, or facilities. That should be the criteria used for deciding what tool or tools or suite of tools you would deploy across your organization.
Okay. Does anyone else want to add to that? Sure, Kurt.
So there's, I'll just voice a slight feeling of disquietness. There's always a trade-off that every organization makes about how much to control and how much to monitor. And we're speaking about human social behaviors that I think everyone here acknowledges are rather opaque, rather difficult to quantify. And I think it's in all of our interests, and certainly in every organization's interest who is putting in place an insider threat monitoring and control system, to understand that there are trade-offs. Even I can imagine the stronger the controls that you place, the less happiness that your users will experience, and this could create a positive feedback situation. I'm not suggesting I have any data on that, but the idea that actions can be taken in an organization on the presumption that the employees are presumed to be bad actors, given an adverse economic circumstance, that may be something that's entirely consistent with the data, but nonetheless, if applied as a blanket policy, can have an adverse effect and an unintended consequence. We are talking about insiders as if, in fact, there are two kinds of things we've been talking about: bad behaviors versus bad people. Bad behavior are easy to detect because you can say, what behaviors do I want to avoid? I don't want to see data exfiltrated from a secure network, and we put a monitor on that. I don't want to see USB sticks being used. We can put controls and monitors on that. It gets a little bit more uncomfortable for me as an engineer and as a concerned social person in the science world to assume that there are bad actors because they're bad, and that we can somehow, by virtue of reading a few psychology papers, start to look for indicators in email about a disgruntlement, and then they rise to the attention of an intelligence officer. I mean, these are all things that are probably necessary to roll out a control and monitoring system, but it's one that I think we should be very cautious about, given the state of our understanding of human behavior and organizational behavior. I think we're engineering such systems, as I said earlier in my talk, without the virtue of having good solid theories behind us. I think a little humility in how these technologies get used, is probably worth having. And I'm not suggesting anyone here has lack of humility, but I certainly don't. But I think it's good to be cautious. And we are creating these social enterprises, and the technologies we roll out are creating the reality that we live in, and that's the nature of the social platforms and social computation that is both exciting and frightening at the same time. We should be concerned, and we should be thoughtful about, over assuming what we know and being cautious about those unintended consequences.
So you raised a really good point. And Bill, it sounds like looks like you might have a follow-up question, but let me...
Shut up, Kurt.
Let me ask one question to finish off the tool question, and then hit Alex and Andy real quick, and then we'll come back to you in case they don't cover that. So are there resources available that our observers, our watchers today can go to get more information on tools in general? Is there some general public forum? Is there a book that describes tools? Is there a website or some other resource forum or blog that reviews tools, for example, that you all might want to suggest or speak out loud? I wouldn't say the word recommend. Or on the other hand, maybe possibly more important, based on what I think I heard you saying, Randy, are there resources where they could go and just try to get more information on identifying what situation they really want to monitor and take action on? Do we have any recommendations or anything we want to kind of put out there?
Well, we do have on our Insider Threat website set of documents that describe various types of tools that may be of use in detecting insider threats, or at least collecting the data necessary to perform the analysis that would detect those insider threats. There are a number of other organizations out there that have published papers on insider threat related tools, such as Gartner's report on data loss prevention software, and there's a large number of other organizations that have very high vested interest in making sure that these tools are as big and as robust as possible.
So let's help Alex out here. I heard CERT and Gartner. Are there any other key names people should be looking for in the tool space? More information, or in the developing a scenario space?
Well, Rob, we have worked with a number of different tool vendors and actually have some instances here on site that we use for evaluation. As a federally funded research development center, we try to avoid listing specific names just because we don't want to give the appearance that we're endorsing a product. But Google is another. It's a good source for sort of bringing to the searcher's attention the tools that are available. And I'd like to point out that insider threat detection tool is probably not the thing to search for. What you really want is the aggregation component, like Randy said, right? You probably already have the tools to gather most of the data. It's how do you put that together? And a lot of the people out there in the space have realized that and are now bringing products to market that are able to do that and have some of these rule sets already built in.
Okay. I guess that means stop asking.
Yeah, I think in terms of, you kind of are touching on the issue of how does an organization know what's important to it, and then deciding what tools can help protect those assets. And I think I think this comes down to risk management, and there are various resources for risk management in the cyber area. I mean, Octave has been used here at CERT and developed here at CERT and for a long time, and there are asset evaluation, risk evaluation methods that have been developed. And I think organizations really need to conduct that kind of risk management in order to decide what is worth protecting, and then they can go to the level of saying, well, how are they going to protect it, and that gets them into the tools area. So there's some preliminary work that needs to be done there.
I think it's also important to understand that not all tools are going to be applicable to all environments, and most organizations have a limit on the compute capacity that they can allocate to any given task, particularly insider threat detection. Often making a justification for the budget necessary to create these large detection mechanisms is very difficult in a lot of organizations. So it's not we're going to buy a solution, stick it in place, and we're done kind of proposition. It is very much a time-intensive effort to understand what metrics are relevant for your organization, as Andy and Bill had pointed out, and which tools can provide those metrics. But not only that, but how fast can I absorb that data, and can I get any actionable intelligence out of it in a reasonable period of time?
Okay. So Kurt touched on a topic about monitoring. And I want to follow up with a question that I have for you, Alex, which is regards to a possible solution when you don't know what the bad guys are doing. So if I understand it correctly, you're trying to extend, in this conversation point, you're trying to extend the research to identify what people are doing and not getting caught. Mm-hmm. So is there a possible solution that could be used? And I think I might have heard earlier something about a two-man rule. Could you possibly explain that for us and how that might handle that part of the issue that Kurt was concerned with monitoring?
Well, I'm not sure how well it addresses Kurt's monitoring concerns, but the two-man rule I was discussing in my earlier presentation essentially is using the ability of an operating system or an application to enforce two-person control over any given action, so that if one person wants to do an action, they can access the application, make something happen, but then somebody else has to come along and sign off on it before that action is actually executed. And for a lot of instances, that can cut down on the sort of the lone gunman approach to insider threat. The idea being that if you have to tell somebody else that you just did something nefarious and try to make up an excuse why it was necessary, you've got a much greater chance of whatever action that is being detected later on, especially if you have to log these things or it comes up in front of a change of control board or things and so on and so forth later on. But in terms of the actual, what are the bad guys doing that we don't know about yet, we have to go a little bit farther afield. We're actually looking at research that will help us understand what the range of the possible is. Quite frankly, we don't know what we don't know just yet. And so to do that, we are trying to take advantage of the sort of the, I don't know quite how to describe it, but it's the human nature of, what would happen if I did that? Or, I'm not normally a bad person, but hey, I could, if I really wanted to do this bad thing, how would I go about doing it? If I wanted to go rob a bank tomorrow, well, okay, there's that camera over there, and there's that policeman over there. And starting to just kind of thinking about things like that. So as we sit around and we have these conversations about, well, what if? The idea is, can we capture those what ifs? And so what we're looking at actually is the creation of virtual environments, the equivalent essentially of a game that is all about the insider threat. And creation of a virtual environment that can be used and just hand it off to somebody and say, okay, here's your environment. Go do things. Go see what they do. Watch how they approach the problem. Structure it such that it closely mimics what they would be doing in a real-world environment. So they have tasks they have to get done by the end of the day, and that they have interrupts that come by, phone calls that happen, or people who stop by and chat at the most inopportune times. Things like that that allow us to and put them in a realistic simulation such that they can actually do the things in the simulation that they'd be able to do in the real world. Stick a USB drive in their pocket, or quite frankly, toss a USB stick out the window and go down and pick it up off the sidewalk later. The things that we wouldn't necessarily think of because we're kind of focused in our own little controls area, but the people who aren't getting caught obviously aren't in that one little box that we're already looking at.
Right. Okay. So, Andy, Kurt mentioned monitoring. Alex talked about maybe possibly a two-person rule. What are other issues with unintended consequences that might come from measuring?
I think whenever you're talking, we've talked some about tools. I think, moving from tools to controls or practices is a natural thing because, the technology is only going to get us a certain distance here. And so we need to talk about controls and practices, and the common sense guide that's been made available to the audience, I think, is something that where they've taken essentially a plethora of potential controls or practices and said, well, which ones are kind of the highest priority if insider threats are concerned. And so I just wanted to make that leap from tools to say, you need to think in the controls and practices space, and that the common sense guide is a reasonable starting point for that, because it says, it not only says these are most important or highest priority potentially, but also it says it gives you real cases to say, here's what happens if you don't do these things. And so it grounds it in those real cases so organizations can take a look at those and say, is this something that's of concern to my organization? And then they can say, okay, this is maybe something I should consider. So now going back to your original question, which was unintended consequences, right? So I think Kurt had a very, he echoed kind of my philosophy behind this, is that we need humility for this. A lot of this is still in the research area, and I know the practitioners out there don't really want to hear that, but it is true, and we have to recognize the limitations of this. Some of the controls, practices, and even tools that we put in place are targeting insiders are targeting employees of the organization. We're all insiders, you know. We're not malicious insiders, hopefully, right? But we're all insiders in one sense or another. And so these controls are affecting us on our daily work. And they have the potential for alienating us. They have the potential for making it hard to hire the people that you want to hire, right?
That was the point I was, it wasn't the monitoring, it was the controls. Yeah. We understand the need to monitor.
Yeah.
But it's the bad actions versus bad people. And I like the idea that, of course, you start with what are you protecting? That's an objective fact. There's nothing ad hominem about it. I mean, we're protecting certain assets. Now we can put controls around our assets. We know that there are bad actors. We need to do better at figuring out who they are. But the presumption that the same techniques, when applied to a blanket population of innocent people, will have no effect on them, I think is a fallacy. Oh, yeah. So we need to, every organization has a finite amount of money. I mean, it could be that putting the money into a fantastic insider threat monitoring system and control system, maybe some of that would be better if they put a gym downstairs. I mean, there are lots of ways to spend the resources, but making it an environment that people can work in and feel unalienated from, these are very complex kind of social phenomena. And as computer scientists, as software engineer, I don't feel like I have the wherewithal to judge where to draw that line, but I think that's part of what it means to do a proper systems engineering of the systems, because we have to understand that it is the policies and practices, and it's the people, and this is a kind of a new realm of system that we're trying to build. It's one that incorporates the vagaries of human behavior as first class, not just as stick figures around use cases in the old traditional systems engineering. So thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
I feel less alienated today.
Sorry, I was going to say, I certainly want to build upon the fact that organizations need to, at the end of the day, trust employees. That's built into every organization. You do need to trust your employees. By focusing on a critical asset of what you're trying to protect, that will separate the insider, which we all are, from the insider threats in your organization. Because really the threat is to the asset. Not every employee is a threat to every asset. Therefore, not everyone is a threat to everything within your organization. So it really is based upon that risk equation of what's a threat to what and what are the potential impacts. Then you can focus your protection strategy at the asset level. Then it really won't make a difference if the threat comes within your organization or outside the organization, or if it's an intentional or malicious insider or an unintentional. Really, the asset protection strategy should be what you do need to focus on. And therefore we start getting away from the big brother attitude of monitoring everything, or this corporate distrust across your entire employee base. It really needs to be focused on the asset strategy, and there are threats to asset which need to be recognized.
Sorry, you first. So touching on what both Randy and Kurt said, that they got close to the point of we want to avoid profiling. We want to apply policies to everyone, but we don't want to apply them in any way that's discriminatory or illegal, but also not oppressive, right? We don't want people to feel distrusted, and so some of our data shows that certain crimes, the gender breakdown is very lopsided towards men, but that doesn't mean monitor men more than women, right? So that's an example of what not to do, but there are other ways that you need to apply policies to people that are at greater risk. For instance, if somebody is terminating, like Andy said, that we've seen that there's a greater risk of data exfiltration, or traveling. If somebody's going to a conference, malware. There's a lot of ways organizations can pick up malware, but one of them is the USB sticks, and you get lots of them at conferences. I'm not saying that conferences are more likely to hand out infected malware, but the point is that people going to conferences, this is just a simple example, people going to conferences bring back stuff, right? So they actually create the risk to the organization. There's nothing about them being, bad people, but if you apply that policy to everyone that's traveling, then you're not profiling. You're actually just using this sort of non-technical indicator to increase your monitoring to those that are at higher risk.
Okay.
Having been on the system administrator side of this equation, and I been the guy doing the monitoring and been the guy trying to determine who's doing what to me at what time of night, particularly at 2 in the morning.
That's
For you.
That's when they're always working.
For them, it's about 3:30 and they just got home from school.
But one of the things I discovered very early on, though, is that the technology side of things, as you pointed out, is interesting, but by and large, the more controls that a technology organization puts out onto the network, particularly the ones that are easy to see from a user standpoint, the more that the users are just going to start balking at things. They're not going to want to do specific actions, even if those actions are well within their job scope, simply because they don't want to have to deal with the jumping through the hoops necessary to actually make it happen. So one of the things we discovered early on was to incentivize doing the right thing. And right now, I think it's taken for granted that people and employees are going to do the right thing on a daily basis. I mean, that's what we're paying for, after all. I mean, they're going to come there, they're going to do all the right things, they're going to be happy employees, and they're going to go home. But taking that for granted, I think, is actually one of the first major mistakes that a company can make. Because if you can incentivize doing the right thing, and you can make doing the right thing significantly harder than doing the wrong thing, I think human nature will take over. And actually, people will drift towards doing the right thing just by nature, which makes the monitoring situation a lot easier to deal with. Because as doing the wrong thing is harder, finding those outliers becomes significantly easier.
Okay, so if we're driving everybody to the left and someone shows up on the right, that's easier to see?
Right. And so if you set up your bonus structure, for instance, so that if somebody has done the right thing for the entire year, they get a bonus at the end of the year. Well, if you start looking at the people who didn't do the right thing for the entire year, we'll say, well, what was their problem? How can I correct that? And start driving them off to the left as well.
Okay. If there's nothing else on that, I want to go back to Randy and the idea of non-technical observables.
Sure.
So what are some of the issues commonly found in the field today when working with non-technical observables? I think I might have heard earlier different countries had different laws. Yes. And I heard you say HR and security, so instantly in my head I'm thinking there's a lot of issues. But what are the common issues today?
Typically the challenge in organization is that many organizations are structured in a silo type of protection of data. So if we take a look at many HR departments, they are protecting of data, which they should be, and they tend not to share that outside of the constructs of what traditional HR would be. In many cases, the IT departments have silos of collection of data, silos of dissemination of data, which keeps within the IT realm. Physical security might be another area of opportunity where they collect information, but they're not willing to share it across the organization. So the challenge is, how do we share that information across the organization and at the same time protect the privacy of the individuals of which the information you're collecting on? So it certainly needs to be a concerted effort across the organization to involve your legal counsel to make sure you know which data you're collecting, make sure that you have clearly defined practices and policies that are consistently enforced, and you have the ability to share some information across the organization to some degree that gives you a picture of employee behavior, but also employee activity on your IT systems. So when we start looking and talking about the non-technical observables, that could be data stored in non-traditional IT managed sources, but it also could be just employee behaviors that are observed within the workplace. So coworkers identifying or seeing something in the workplace, or supervisors seeing something within the workplace. That type of data is a little hard to use a tool to get to when you start seeing someone within the workplace acting outside of whatever their normal day-to-day activity will be. So there's a number of challenges, but again, if you think about the issues of sharing data, it really gets down to the privacy and protection of your employees and the confidentiality of their data, and then how do we then share some of that data across the organization to get a picture of someone who may be more at risk at doing something that you might want to consider suspicious activity across the organization.
Okay. Anyone want to follow up with that or no? Okay, so moving to another topic, yet again keeping us moving here. Kurt, what are some of the issues that are currently facing the research community besides gathering data sets, or is that the biggest problem right now and that's what you're focusing on?
Well, I think there's sort of the basic human science research, which needs to be conducted in the way that science is conducted. And I think then there's applied research, the actual using that and mobilizing it to build systems. And I think we need help there trying to build a bridge from the basic sciences to the applied science. I really, the idea of the non-technical observables, for example, is something that would make sense in our own program, in the Adams program. We are monitoring these host monitored data. That's the technical observables, and I agree. I mean, I think that's what you see people doing, but that's only a small part of what might be an indicator of somebody running into some trouble. And but what are those non-technical observables, and how can we put a label on them so we can refer to them by name? And then what is it we can do in even our own program to map those to something that we might construct synthetically, or to augment the collection that we're getting to anonymized human resources data. We are going to be getting physical data, badge in and badge out, and other kinds of data, helping us to take the concept of the indicator and map it to some concrete representation would be enormously helpful, because without that, it's up to the engineer to figure out, well, how do I take disgruntlement and map that to an email? What is sentiment? We were asked to produce email that represented somebody acting like a depressed person. Well, what does a depressed person's email look like? Are there any research studies that show certain words or density of words or ratios of pronouns or something that we can key in on? Because then we might be able to reproduce that or test it in some other environment. It's getting down to it's the systems part. It's getting down to something that's concrete and measurable, something that can be put into a digital form. That requires a commitment to the specific and the ad hoc, and that's something that no scientist is comfortable doing. But it's what engineers are going to do, whether the sciences help them or not. And I think that's the real challenge, is to find a way to build that bridge.
So are there other things we can look at to draw examples from? For example, controlled trials, as in medical disciplines?
Well, that would be, that is where we're ultimately going to find the ground truth. The question is, can we shortcut that? I mean, can we not have to go straight to human trials and testing in the wild, or is there something we can do in a more controlled way? And I mean, at the moment, I believe there's no way to draw scientific conclusions from tests that are conducted with synthetic data. I think we can produce engineering results, but to draw scientific conclusions, we need real data. And that's part of this conundrum of getting the real sciences to be able to work in a context that's real, but privacy preserving, and still find a way to take the results of that research back out to be replicated without violating privacy. We can't make up, the insiders synthetically. Even, Alex, even creating an environment or a playground for people to play in, that's still a playground for playing in. It's not the place where somebody's losing their job or they're afraid of whatever's happening in their life, and it's not the place where crimes will be born. It's slightly more difficult than that. So it's not really a great answer, I know, but we need to kind of get the real sciences to give us something to build on. And I don't have an answer, but I think somehow getting real corpus data protected by privacy to do research within those settings without causing harm to the users, but taking the results back out. I mean, if we find some systematic way of doing that, some way that we can trust, that will be more like a method for doing the research, I think that's going to produce some great value. But at the moment, that's the real challenge for me. And to your earlier question, were there any tools for doing scenarios? If there are any tools for generating data for insider threat tests, I haven't seen them, but we're producing what we think will be a useful story generator capability, and if we can get the insider threat community to define stories in that kind of notion, or to define cases that we can use, we'll get more eyes on that story side. Perhaps we can generate data and have that targeted to private corpuses and whatever companies are collecting their data, so that they can maybe try to curate the mappings from the high-level stories and qualities down to their own indicators. Find a way to report those results back in some way so that we can learn from each other. And that's a methodological thing. That's something about the social practice of doing this work, and it's harder.
So, Randy, we have about 6 minutes left. As the technical manager for that team, how do people get information back to you?
We certainly welcome the feedback from the research community as well as the operational community. Given that we're a federally funded research and development center, we're always looking for the external community to influence our research directions, and certainly wish and want to collaborate with organizations that are out there. So I certainly would recommend to go to our website, cert.org, insider_threat, for all of the research that we've done, for ways that we describe the insider threat problem, for the controls that Alex's team is responsible for developing. It just has a great way to present information out to the community. And we certainly welcome through our insider threat feedback alias to contact any of us up here on the panel directly. But again, the goal is that we want to take the academic research and apply it to the operational community and provide some value that has some validity in what we say are recommended best practices. And we're able to measure those and say that we are better today than we were yesterday because of the things that we're doing to protect our critical assets. So please go out to our website and reach out to anyone on this panel or anyone that you've talked to or heard from throughout the day today, and certainly reach out to CERT as a whole. And we do welcome your feedback and opinions on what we've done so far and where we should go in the future.
Perfect. Any other parting shots? I think we're at a good wrapping up point if there's not. Are there any? Kurt?
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob, very much. Great job.
That was like 3 sentences. Okay. Shane, it looks like we're finished now.
Okay, thanks everyone for a really great discussion, all the great presentations today. Rob, appreciate you facilitating here this afternoon. Great job by everybody. That's going to wrap up managing the insider threat, what every organization should know. I think we're going to call it what every organization does know now, because we shared an awful lot of content today. We really appreciate everyone's time. A couple reminders that the whole day was archived. So as soon as tomorrow, this asset will be available on demand. It's the same link you used to log in today. So we ask that you share with colleagues, coworkers, your social network, as we want this content to live on. Also on the survey widget, if you haven't done so, please fill out the survey. We'd love to get your feedback on what you thought of the event. And if we're going to do future events like this, we'd love to get your feedback. And again, thank you very much for spending the day with us. Again, thanks to all our presenters, and have a great evening, everyone.